Well, when I was thinking about what I was going to write next, and what I wrote next turned out to be Remember Me, I had just finished and had just released my previous book, my sixth, which was called The Secrets of Strangers, and that was set in a little cafe in South London. So in that story, most of the action and the narrative took place within the four walls of this small cafe. And I loved writing it, but when it came to thinking about my next book, I knew that I didn't want it to be set within such small parameters again. I wanted a much bigger landscape, a much bigger scope, and just something completely different, having spent 2 years in that cafe. And so I also knew that I wanted this next book to be set in New Zealand. I wanted to bring it home to New Zealand. That was important to me. I wanted to set it in the Ruahine Ranges, which is where I live now and where I've lived off and on in the whole time I've lived in New Zealand, over 20 years, and a place I'm very fond of that means a lot to me. So I had those ideas, and that came together with an interest in writing about dementia, something I wanted to explore, something I've been thinking about. You have these ideas bubbling away in your head, and about being lost and about memory. And there's another theme, a major theme really, or two, that I probably can't talk about because they would be spoilers, but which are really important and which were pretty central and which I really wanted to write about at that time. So I had all these different ideas. I wasn't sure how they would work together, but I thought about it. I went for long walks. I thought about it again. I drew mind maps. I sort of slept on it and dreamt about it, and eventually I came up with a plan which turned into a synopsis, which eventually turned into this book, Remember Me. I began to write it when I was living in Wellington for complicated reasons, and I was writing during the start of the COVID pandemic in March 2020, a very strange time. And I remember sitting in my flat in Wellington looking out across the botanical gardens towards a beehive, and everything was very odd. And there I was writing this book, Remember Me. Well, there were two parts to my answer. The first is what I did before I even started to write, and that is, as I said earlier, I spent weeks thinking about exactly how the plot would work, who was in it, who would do what when, what exactly I was trying to achieve, what were the interlocking stories I was trying to tell, and I would go for long walks, thinking, walking through the botanical gardens in Wellington, thinking about everything and how is it going to mesh together. And then as I wrote the story, of course, it evolved further, and I kept having to reevaluate and scribbling little notes and sometimes drawing mind maps. And then the second major part, though, for me anyway, of plotting and of making everything fit together and layer together, is the editing. And for me, the editing takes at least as long as the writing. I edit and I edit and I edit. Each line has about 10 ghosts. It's been rewritten so many times. And as I edit it, these layers begin to become more subtle and to work together better. The clunkiness is gradually ironed out, at least I hope it is, most of it. So by the end of the final editing process, I hope I've got something that runs pretty smoothly and where all the different aspects and layers and facets work together. Well, I did find it a challenge to write about dementia in a work of fiction. That's to say, I found it a challenge because I really wanted to do a good job of it. I wanted to make Felix, the father who has dementia. I wanted to make him real. I wanted it to be respectful. I wanted to get the progression of it right and believable. Because sometimes dementia in fiction can be used as a bit of a plot device, and I that wasn't where I was going with it. I had some experience of dementia because my mother, who died in 2016, had Alzheimer's, and it really took away much of who she was before she died. But I remember when she was very ill, I headed off to England. I didn't make it in time. I heard the news that she died when I was in Hong Kong. But I did get there in time to help my father and my brothers and sisters organise things. And I remember being in Mum's bedroom, and I was going through the drawers and trying to sort things out and so on. And it suddenly struck me that it was a bit like a time capsule or a museum. Because it became clear to me that she must have been really quite compromised earlier than we'd realised, because all the letters and the magazines, the correspondence and things around that room piled up were from years earlier, back in 2009 or 10. And then in a drawer I found a pile of her diaries. And I realised that she'd been trying to remind herself, trying to have memoirs to remind herself of who she was. And she'd written in the back of one of them, she'd written the names of all of us, all her children. There were 7 of us. And my father's name, and she'd written the name of Yanni, a little girl who came to stay with the family, with the Kindertransport in the war. And she'd written, I am a teacher and I play a violin, this kind of thing. And so I realised, first of all, that there was a tremendous amount of paddling under the surface to remain as normal and competent as she could, and to hide what was happening to her. And second, I realised that she must have been absolutely terrified. And so and that was something I wish I'd realised when she was alive. So I brought what I learnt from my mother into the writing of Remember Me, and in a way I owe this book to her. By the time I started to write this story, or any of them apart from my very first, I already had thought about it for a long time. I already had a synopsis with quite a detailed plot. I already knew who my characters would be, basically. I knew that a woman called Emily would come from England, and that this story was partly about her distant relationship with her father and how much better she came to know him and discover that he was somebody completely different from what she'd thought as his mind began to melt into dementia. So all of that was in place when I began to write. As I wrote, I got to know the characters better. They became more fully formed, more three-dimensional. And of course, it becomes a process, because as you get to know them and you write them with more depth and you go back and edit it and you add in more colour, then they become more real, but they become more real to you as a writer. So it's a sort of cyclical process, and that's why I'm so fond of the editing process, because with each pass over, with each addition of more depth, that character becomes to me more real and three-dimensional. I try to ask myself, what does this person know about themselves that they don't want other people to know? And what do other people see in them that they themselves don't know? And in doing that, I find I get a sort of insight into that character. It's a quick way in for me to get to know them better. Were some of them created in order to drive the plot along? Probably not really. I mean, they were in the sense that they're all part of the plot, and Emily's brother and sister are certainly partially there in order to add some conflict. But really, they're all there because they're part of that world. They are the world of Remember Me, and that's why the characters are there. This story had to be set in a real wilderness. It had to be set somewhere where somebody could walk into the bush, an experienced tramper like Dr. Leah Parata in my story. She could walk into the mountains and never be seen again. And searchers could go out looking for her for days and weeks and never find her. She could completely disappear. And there aren't many places in Britain, for sure, where that could happen, but we know that it does happen in New Zealand. Almost every year we hear of somebody completely disappearing into New Zealand's wilderness. It can happen quite easily here, either deliberately or otherwise. So I chose it for that reason, but also because of the nature of this story. I really wanted the sort of magic of New Zealand. There's something I've never met anywhere else about New Zealand's native bush. You know, when you walk in and you hear those sounds and you smell the moss and the dripping ferns and hear the birds, there's nothing like it. And I really wanted that to be a character in this story. And finally, there's the small town aspect. This is set in a small community with everything that involves. And there's something in particular about the New Zealand small town. I live near Waitlists. I've lived here on and off for years, and I've got to know it quite well. So I wanted to encapsulate that and bring that in as well. So all kinds of reasons why I set this in New Zealand, and I'm very glad I did. Well, I'm glad you asked me about the cover because it's actually quite interesting, although I had absolutely nothing to do with its design. I had no input. That's really normal. I tend to just be asked if I want to veto a cover, but I don't have input into the design. After all, I'm not a graphic designer. But here it is anyway. Here's the cover. And I really do love this one. Of all my books, they've often been put into different editions, different languages and so on, and there have been all kinds of covers, but honestly I think this could be my favourite. Here is the Ruahine Ranges with a sort of misty distance. It's very atmospheric, and here in the corner in the orange is Howlett's hut, which is one of the tramping huts way up in the ranges, and those of you who have read the book will recognise the idea of the huts up there. Some of you may even have been to Howlett's hut. And this picture, this photograph, was taken, I'm told, by an academic from Auckland University in the medical sciences. And there's something particularly sort of fun and wonderful about that, because the protagonist, the character in the book who disappears into the ranges, is Dr. Leah Parata, who is also an academic and a scientist. So a cover that I am very fond of, and very grateful to my publishers for designing. There we are. Well, where do I start? There was quite an eclectic mix. One of my great obsessions when I was growing up, from the age of 8 onwards really, was the Bronte sisters. I lived in North Yorkshire. I was a vicar's daughter. We lived in cold vicarages. I was one of 7 children. So I suppose I felt I had a lot in common with them. And I read, from a very young age, I read everything they wrote and their poems, and I read books about them as well. And I really became quite a sort of fangirl of all the Brontes. And I think there was a time when I secretly thought I might even be Emily Bronte, reincarnated. And I used to prance about on the North Yorkshire moors, picking harebells and making up terrible poetry. But it wasn't just them. There were lots of other writers as well. I read Dick Francis, the crime writer who writes about horse racing. And P.G. Wodehouse was my saviour. P.G. Wodehouse kept me cheerful. If I was down at school, if things were going wrong, I would reach for Blandings Castle and everything would seem better, and I still do to this day. And then there was Richard Adams, who wrote Watership Down. I read all his books, but Watership Down in particular. I was given that book when I think I was 8, and I read it and read it and read it. I remember my siblings had all left home. There was just me left, and I was quite bored and lonely. And I read that book over and again. My brother, Paul, queued up in the rain to get me a signed copy of it. But I remember reading it for the first time and coming to the passage where the rabbits are trying to leave Ephrathah, and the storm is coming and the clouds are lowering and the light has become heavy and the first raindrops are about to fall. And Adams describes this crystalline light as the rabbits are crouched there by the river. And I distinctly remember, aged 8 or 9, reading this passage and thinking, I know exactly what this writer means. And it was so wonderful to feel that somebody else had not only sort of experienced what I had, but had cared enough to want to put it into writing and to describe it. And I think that's really what I've been trying to do with my writing ever since. Well, I'm absolutely delighted and honoured and so grateful that Remember Me has been selected. It's an amazing thing to think of people all around the country being encouraged to read the book at the same time, to talk about it. The whole point about writing books, stories, is for people to read them. A story comes to life when it's read. So the more people that read the story, the better from my point of view, and it's just wonderful. I once read a foreword by a writer, and she said, if I were alone on a desert island, I would still write, even if I thought nobody would ever read what I write. Well, I don't agree. From where I'm sitting, the whole point of telling stories is for people to engage in that with you. So I am absolutely delighted and beside myself with glee that Remember Me is on the Together We Read choice this year. Thank you. Yes, well, my next project is my next book, number 8. I'm partway through the process. I've written the first draft, it's been to my editor, it's come back, and now I'm doing the structural edits, which is quite a big rewrite, which is absolutely normal part of the process and which I really quite enjoy. But lots of work still to be done on that, but it should be out next year. It's about a family who live in North Yorkshire, and one of the family falls down the conspiracy theory rabbit hole, and the research has been absolutely fascinating and terrifying, and I have learned so much from it. But that's one of the things I love about writing, is the research. So out next year, and watch this space.